Got a minute or two? We have a way to make it not okay. Welcome to Sinister Minutes. I'm your host, writer and storyteller, Kurt Homer. Next to me is the master of macabre musical musings, the maestro of mood, Tim Parker. Together, let us take you on a journey into the dark heart of disturbing. Sinister Minutes. It's not okay. Sinister Minutes features tales that include disturbing content. That's intentional, because like the podcast itself, the creators here at Sinister Minutes are really not okay. Content featured on this podcast may include descriptions of abuse, addiction, alcohol, blood, bodily fluids, bondage, bones, bullying, burning, cancer, cannibalism, cheating, clowns, coma, confinement, control, cults, death, decapitation, depression, diet, divorce, domestic abuse, drowning, drugs, dying, eating disorders, epidemics, experimentation, family conflict, fear, fighting, fire, gaslighting, ghosts, gore, guns, harassment, hate crimes, hazing, homelessness, homicide, hospitalization, hostage situations, hostile work environments, illness, incarceration, infidelity, injury, institutionalization, kidnapping, manipulation, medical procedures, memory problems, mental health issues, military service, misogyny, murder, mutilation, needles, nightmares, nudity, pain, panic attacks, paralysis, physical abuse, pornography, physical assault, police brutality, poverty, profanity, religion, robbery, scars, screaming, self-harm, smoking, hate, spider, stabbing, stalking, starvation, substance abuse, suicide, terrorism, threats, torture, victim blaming, violence, war, weapons, weather, and maybe, just maybe, witches. Firebug. Dean loved the rich, pungent smell of the smoke, the pounding waves of heat, the roar of the living, breathing inferno. His inferno. His heart raced in cadence with the roaring blaze. High overhead, the tips of the flames darted from the windows of the old warehouse, licking at the broken panes, teasing him. "Hey, paisan, get going. It's not safe here." Dean snapped out of his reverie. The firefighter stood only feet away, bathed in perspiration, features streaked with soot. A knight in black armor, thought Dean, in his mind an image of the other man peeling away the bulky uniform rose unbidden. Dean forced his gaze away from the grime-covered face, fearful the other man had somehow seen into his soul, glimpsed his lewd visions. I'm sorry," he stammered. I guess I just—" "Whatever," said the Black Knight. "If you gotta watch, you gotta go cross the street." Dean turned in the direction the man indicated, stuttering out something stupid won't make up for a bad first impression, he thought. Drooling all over the man won't either. At the opposite curb, Dean's disgust with himself grew greater. Only a few scattered spectators had gathered there. A fire of this size usually drew a bigger crowd. He shook his head, trying to recapture the passion of the roaring inferno within himself. The size of the audience certainly wasn't the fire's fault. The hour was late, and the neighborhood was shaky at best. Before the warehouse, 3 pumpers ran full bore, hoses gushing. Instead of being quenched, the flames grew ever more intense. They might as well have been dousing it with kerosene. Dean closed his eyes, feeling the waves of heat pulse over him. His whole body tingled as the flashing lights thrust past his closed eyelids, penetrating his brain, awakening the memories. 12-year-old Dean and his friend Vinny had taken a new trail through the woods and popped out right behind Mrs. Flett's abandoned chicken coop. The rusty paddock on the door held firm, but a busted-out window in the back provided an opening. Using matches to provide sufficient light to see had turned into a game of flicking lit matches through the window. "This sucks," said Vinny. "Let's go." "In a minute," replied Dean. When Vinny wandered off, Dean crawled inside. The coop stunk of mold and flocks of chickens long since gone. Dean shot a glance out the window behind him. He couldn't see around the side of the chicken coop, but Vinny was probably already halfway home. Good. He struck a match and held it below a dangling strip of tar paper. The paper didn't catch, and Dean dropped the match just before it burnt his trembling fingers. A second match fared no better. The third match was the last one in the book. "Come on," Dean whispered. I need this." He stroked the head along the back of the matchbook, and a tiny flame shot out, a fresh beacon in the moldering darkness. He moved his hand toward the tar paper once more. A tiny curl of black smoke crept up and away. Dean focused his gaze on the juncture between match and paper, between fire and smoke. The match burned down to his thumb and index finger, but he held on in spite of the pain. It took. A tiny flame nibbled at the edges of the paper, then took larger bites. Dean dropped the match and thrust his singed digits into his mouth, sulfur and dirt on his tongue. Smoke filled the room, and he breathed through his mouth, trying to keep the acrid fumes from burning his nostrils, to linger just a little bit longer. The fire grew higher, and Dean felt a part of himself melting down, flowing into the flames, both feeding them and feeding upon them. The heat pulsed from the fire, but instead of pushing it back, it drew him ever closer. It was the taste of tar on the roof of his mouth that finally broke the spell and drove him away. Reluctantly tearing his focus from the blaze, he wriggled back through the window. Outside, gasping in mouthfuls of clean air, he gazed back at the bright orange glow within. The coop had been old, dead, forgotten. He tingled, excited that he'd brought it to life. He hated turning his back on his creation, but self-preservation won out. As casually as he could, Dean walked toward the road. Running would only draw the attention of grown-ups. They'd never understand. Dean swung his gaze, catching motion in the shadows beyond the tree line. His heart pounding, he forced himself to keep moving at the same pace. Somebody there? Have I been seen? Vinny was waiting for him. "Hey, want to come over? My dad's got a new Playboy." Cool, said Dean. He doesn't know. The real excitement would come from being able to watch his creation grow from Vinny's bedroom window. "Okay, everybody out of here, now!" Dean snapped his eyes open, disoriented. Across the street, the flames surged higher, wrapping themselves around the old building, squeezing it in their grasp. 2 patrol cars had arrived, and a cop was headed across the street, bullhorn in hand. "Folks, return to your homes. This area is extremely dangerous." Does that mean there are explosives? Dean barely stifled his grin. Stepping back from the curbside, he ducked into the shadows as the small crowd dispersed. Return to our homes? Hell, what could possibly feel more like home than a cheery, roaring fire? Nobody had seen him. The cop turned and walked back the way he'd come, occasionally glancing around to make sure no one new was arriving for the show. The dark alleyway blocked some of the heat, but at least he could watch the inferno. Explosions were always exhilarating, flames shooting higher and higher, heat and smoke pouring forth, the rushing sound rising to a fever pitch, and suddenly, boom! All the senses slammed at once. It was even better when it came as a surprise. The first time Dean had done a house, he hadn't expected it at all. The place had been abandoned for years, nobody even looking at it. Who would have expected all those propane tanks in the basement? The old man who'd lived there had been a hoarder. Stacks of old newspapers lined the wall, and the floor was littered with mountains of junk mail and trash. All that ugly trash, but with a little effort from him, something beautiful was born. He hated using gasoline or other chemicals if he could avoid it. Better to start small. Dean preferred the gradual approach, beginning with the shudder that went through him when he lit the match, always a match, that would spark the inferno. But if his creation found something to consume. Nice fire. Dean whipped around with a gasp. Who's there? Sorry, said a voice somewhere in the darkness. Didn't mean to startle you. Just enjoying the show. The voice was deep and melodic, carrying a hint of an accent, one that Dean couldn't place. The man's silhouette separated itself from the shadows, coming closer. Dean glanced across the street, but all eyes were on the fire. No one was paying any attention to the alley. His heart still beating fast, he looked back at the man. The long cloak seemed out of place in the warm night air. Only the face was showing, and bronze skin glistened in the firelight. Dean stared, filled with a sudden desire to step closer, but afraid to break the spell. The man's dark eyes twinkled, and Dean sensed more in that gaze than the mere reflection of the flames. He shuddered, then relaxed and smiled. There was recognition, a sense of kinship that passed without words between them. Yours? Asked the man with a slight gesture towards the inferno. Dean nodded without hesitation. Trusting his instincts, he forced himself to break his gaze from the other man's and turn to face his fire again. Amazing what a little effort can summon, isn't it? The man said. The two of them stood side by side, the cloaked figure putting his hand on Dean's shoulder. Dean's consciousness focused on that point of contact. He felt heat radiating from it, flowing through his body, making him feel strong, and at the same time ready to collapse. Who are you? I'm called Elaz, said the man, answering the unspoken question. I've been looking for you, Dean. Dean snapped his head around, mouth agape. Elaz turned and put his finger to Dean's lips, shushing him. Then he laughed, a warm, comforting sound. Yes, I know who you are, and you know me, too. Elaz now stood directly in front of Dean, scant inches between them. He blocked the fire, but it was okay. For Dean, the fire had moved much closer. Dean gazed into the handsome, deeply tanned face and offered no resistance when the man wrapped his arms around him. The deep kiss felt as natural as striking a match, and even more electrifying. 1,000 images fought for attention behind Dean's closed eyes. Flames shot skyward, the fire of the century. Around him everything burned, the ground beneath his feet giving way to a river of molten rock. The heat was intense, excruciating, exhilarating. Dean broke away from the embrace and opened his eyes, breathing hard. He was out on the curb. The warehouse across the street still burning out of control. Of Elaz, there was no sign. He turned and headed for home, his eyes on the flickering orange sidewalk, his mind elsewhere. Any other time, he'd have lingered in the shadows and watched until the fire was well diminished, but tonight, the flames alone no longer aroused his interest. Heat pulsed in. The sweat that cascaded over Dean's skin offered no respite, instead cooking him in his own juices. Around his naked feet and legs, the flames licked ever higher. He was there, cloak falling loosely behind him. Alaz stepped through flames as easily as another man might step through a puddle of water. Reaching out with a single finger, he touched Dean on the cheek. Burning, beautiful pain shot through him, taking his breath away. The blaze writhed at the periphery of his vision, but the gaze of the cloaked man captured Dean's focus. In those eyes burned a different fire, a darker, hotter flame. It was a vision of hell, fire and brimstone, searing heat all around. Hell, perhaps, to anyone but Dean. The man stepped closer, and the rest of the world faded from view. Dean snapped upright, flecks of sweat raining from his skin. Dim light coming through the blinds helped him find his bearings. Rumpled sheets and blankets, the otherwise unfurnished room, all those things were familiar, rooting him back into his own space. He reached out, knowing that there was no one there, but unable to stop himself. Empty bed, empty heart, he thought. Empty life. Screwed up another one. Everything about the relationship had been great, for a while. But as time passed, like always, that initial intense heat faded into a lukewarm facade. Another lover fades into my past. A genuine goddamn fireman this time. What the hell's wrong with me? Kicking off the blankets, Dean padded across the floor and opened the blinds. Outside, the lights of the city tried to keep the darkness contained, but shadows crept from every crevice. In the distance, a lone siren wailed, and Dean found no respite in the normally comforting sound. The first match was always the best. Stroking it against the box, smelling the sulfur, feeling the flame against the skin of his arm, a tickling warmth that quickly grew to sweet, blissful pain. Some nights it only took a single match to bring him relief. This night was not one of those. The matchbox was empty. Dean's arm throbbed with the pain of a dozen separate points of burning. It was better, but not enough. He needed the release that only a larger fire could bring. Real, passionate heat, and the mysterious man who taunted him with it. A month passed, and the dark man was nowhere to be found, in or out of dreams. Every day, Dean rose and joined the anonymous herd. Unlike them, Dean didn't find escape in sitcoms or pop singers, football teams or social networks. Even his personal escape, the sweet release of a box of matches, was no longer sufficient. He needed something truly fulfilling. That something took the shape of an abandoned building on the fringes of urban civilization. In its heyday, the Vestal had been the dark star of the city. Built before the turn of the century, the hotel had gained notoriety as an underworld hangout during Prohibition. For all its bad reputation, it had once been a prime tourist destination. Little remained of its former splendor. It was one of the only structures remaining in a long abandoned neighborhood. Breaking in was simple. It was obvious Dean was not the first to do so. He strode through the once lavish lobby, now littered with broken glass and reeking of stale beer and urine. The wall behind the front desk was full of graffiti, a memorial to those who had been there and what they claimed they had done. He went from room to room, checking for inhabitants. It had been months, maybe even years, since anyone had disturbed the thick layer of dust covering every surface. In the center of the dining room, a small pile of charred debris on the floor and a ceiling black with soot told Dean that his idea for the future of the place was not original. He wondered why it hadn't caught, then smiled. No one would ever look at his work and wonder that. On the next visit, Dean brought his tools. Atop them lay his box of matches. Early in the morning, he began dragging furniture into the room and breaking it down into manageable pieces. By noon, the stack of wood almost reached the ceiling, and he stuffed reams of paper from the hotel office into the cracks. 2 hours later, he was done. Time for waiting, for teasing himself with anticipation. The pyre was laid, but he couldn't light it. Not yet. Light the fire right away and it would burn through the day, thick plumes of black smoke billowing into the sky. But smoke was not the goal. Dancing flames would be lost in bright sunshine. It had to be night, deep, dark night, when the fire can be the sun, the center of the universe. Patience, anticipation should be savored. Dean sat on the floor next to the shrine of flammables he'd built, mind wrapped around the flames to come. He resisted the urge to touch himself, knowing the release would be all the more intense if he waited. Out in the hallway, the darkness slipped in through cracked windows. It was time. He inspected the tiny magical wand gripped in his fingers. To most, it would look like any other wooden match. But Dean knew its true purpose. He saw the potential for life within it. It wouldn't be used to light a stove or a cigarette. No, this match would give birth to magnificence. He struck it and inhaled deeply as the tiny flame rose from the end of the matchstick. Reverently, he moved it to the base of the pile. He held the match there long after the pile of debris had caught, long after his fingers had blistered. The flames grew higher. The heat caressed him. Crackling sounds were a prelude to the coming symphony, and his nostrils filled with smoky perfume. He had delayed long enough, time to step back and watch his creation grow, watch it swirl and dance. He turned toward the door. It was gone. Dean shook his head, confused. He squeezed his watery, burning eyes shut, then looked again. Still no door. In the center of the room, the flames leapt higher, hotter. Smoke grew ever thicker, more pungent. Heat scraped at his throat. What the? Dean skirted the edge of the room, keeping one eye on the rising flames in the center. The smoke pulsed with life, blocking him. He walked straight, blind, until he touched a wall. Eyes and throat burning, he felt his way to a corner, then another. No doors, no windows, no way out. Fire slithered across the old hardwood floor, the ancient varnish bubbling, then bursting into flame. Dean stood near the last wall he'd checked, facing the fire, and a small giggle escaped his parched lips. The crackling of a campfire had given way to the roar of a wild beast. Dean looked into the heart of the flames, a grip locked on his face, and he knew he was not alone. He had come. In the center of the inferno, the shape appeared, dark against the bright flames, yet a part of them. It grew larger and more distinct, separating itself. Alaz stepped free of the fire, voice booming over the roaring blaze. "I've been expecting you." Dean's smile widened as the man swept him up in his arms. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his stammer gone. Eyes closed, he was lost in the embrace. Sweat steamed from his brow as the heat burned through his soul. The passion flowed everywhere, every nerve awake, alive. He wanted the moment to last forever. He opened his eyes, fearful that the scene would evaporate as it had before. It did not. The fire raged on in the center of the room, burning bright and hot. Around it, people danced, beautiful naked bodies intertwined, glowing with sweat and the reflection of the flames. There was no sound above the roar of the fire, yet he felt the beating of his heart and saw that they danced in cadence to it. Dean shook his head, confused. The dancers raged on, stamping and whirling madly. By now the fire should have engulfed the entire hotel. Somehow it was still contained. There was no sign at all that it had burned through the ceiling or even reached the walls, unless... Am I dead? He asked the cloaked figure who stood before him, gripping his hands. Is that important? Was the reply. Dean thought about it. He felt alive, tiny bolts of lightning racing across his skin. The flames and the dancers whirled around him, roaring their approval. No, he answered, it's not. Elaz laughed and drew him to the dance. Sinister Minutes is presented by Kurt Homan and Tim Parker. The musical score was composed and performed by Tim Parker. Our production team consists of Kurt Homan and Tim Parker. On behalf of everyone here at the Sinister Minutes podcast, namely Kurt Homan and Tim Parker, we thank you for listening, for joining us as we explore all the ways in which we are not okay. This audio program is copyright 2024 by Kurt Homan and Tim Parker under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.